The smell of whiskey always clings to promises he can't keep. I've grown to hate that sharp, biting scent, even as it weaves itself into the fabric of my life, saturating every corner of my marriage. It wasn't always this way. When we first met, Connor's eyes burned with a quiet intensity, a promise of steadiness, a life that would never waver. But something shifted over the years, something raw and brittle splintered in him. And now, after every fight, it's the same story. He stumbles home late, reeking of booze, his voice a slurry of apologies and promises. I'll do better. I'll change. You're my world. The first few times I wanted to believe him. I clung to those words like a lifeline, convincing myself he meant it, that his heart was still tethered to mine despite the storms we seemed to summon. But words are easy, and the weight of those promises has become unbearable. Our last argument was bad. It started small as they often do, a forgotten chore, an offhand remark, but it escalated the way a spark consumes dry timber. His temper flared, and so did mine, until the house felt too small to contain the heat. I told him I was done. He said things I can't forget. And then he left, slamming the door behind him. Hours later I heard his key in the lock. The door creaked open and there he was, disheveled, red-eyed and soaked in regret. He sat on the edge of our bed, head in his hands, mumbling his usual script. I swear this time it's different. I'll fix everything. The whiskey bottle clutched in his hand undermined every word. I didn't have the strength to argue. Instead I turned my back to him, staring at the wall and pretending I didn't care. But I did. I always do. The next morning, Connor was quiet, his apologies muted by a hangover. He left early, muttering something about clearing his head, and I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee, replaying our fight in my mind. I don't even know what I was looking for anymore. A reason to keep trying, perhaps. Some evidence that we weren't just two people clinging to the memory of what we used to be. That's when I found the pictures. I wasn't snooping. His laptop was open on the kitchen counter, a faint glow illuminating the screen. A notification pinged, an email. I clicked on it without thinking, just to make the sound stop. But what I saw stopped me cold. It was an album of photos sent from a friend of his. The subject line read, "Great night, man. You wild thing." I should have stopped. I should have closed the laptop and pretended I didn't see it. But I didn't. My hands trembled as I clicked the link, and there they were, a slideshow of betrayal. Connor smiling, laughing, his arm draped around a woman I didn't recognize. Her head tilted toward his, her lips brushing against his in one of the pictures. In another, his hands were on her waist, pulling her close. The timestamp said it all. These were taken last night. The same night he had come home to me, swearing he'd change. I felt hollow. It was like the ground beneath me had given way, and I was free-falling into nothingness. The coffee grew cold in front of me as I stared at the photos, my mind racing. I didn't cry. Not at first. Instead, I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. A determination I hadn't felt in years. If he thought I was going to let this slide, he was wrong. When Connor came home that evening, I played my part perfectly. I greeted him with a small, tired smile, as though I'd spent the day reflecting and had come to a resolution. He looked surprised but relieved, a flicker of hope lighting his face. "I think we need to talk," I said softly, motioning for him to sit down. He nodded, his expression earnest, eager to mend the fragile peace between us. I told him I forgave him. I told him I believed in his promises, that I wanted to work on us. It wasn't easy to say the words, knowing what I did, but I forced them out, painting over the bitterness with a veneer of sincerity. He bought it. Of course he did. He wanted to believe it as much as I needed him to. For the next few days I pretended everything was fine. I cooked dinner. I laughed at his jokes. I kissed him goodnight. But beneath the surface I was watching, waiting, searching for the cracks in his story. And they came just as I knew they would. A text he tried to hide. A phone call he stepped outside to take. Little signs, insignificant on their own, but together they formed a picture, a pattern. I waited for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to corner him with the truth. Came sooner than I expected. He'd gone out again, promising me it was just for a drink with an old friend. Nothing crazy, he'd said, kissing my forehead before he left. But I knew better. I waited an hour, then another, before grabbing my keys and driving to the bar he frequented. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately. He was at a table in the corner, leaning close to the same woman from the photos, his hand resting on hers. She laughed at something he said, her head tilting back, her hair catching the dim light. My chest tightened, anger bubbling up, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to see it, to feel the full weight of his betrayal. I didn't confront him then. Instead, I left quietly, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. When he came home later, I was already in bed, feigning sleep. He climbed in beside me, whispering another apology into the darkness, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. The next morning I confronted him. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply showed him the photos and waited for his reaction. He stammered, his excuses tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to explain. It wasn't what it looked like, he said. I was drunk. It didn't mean anything. But I didn't care about his excuses anymore. I'd heard them all before, wrapped in the same empty promises. I told him I was done. For real this time. His face crumpled, panic flashing in his eyes, but I didn't falter. I'd given him enough chances, enough of my heart, enough of my life. I wasn't going to waste another moment on his lies. As I packed my bags, he begged me to stay, swearing he'd change. But his words were just noise to me now, drowned out by the memory of those photos and the realization that I deserved better. When I walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief, the weight of his promises finally lifting from my shoulders. He'd always been good at making promises, but this time I wasn't going to stick around to see him break them. As I walked out the door, I half expected him to follow me, to make some grand gesture or say something that would pull me back in. But the silence that followed was heavier than anything he could have said. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove without a plan. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but my mind was a fog of emotions I couldn't sort through. Anger, sadness, disappointment, they all swirled together, leaving me feeling hollow and unsteady. I drove aimlessly, letting the hum of the tires on the road fill the emptiness. Eventually, I ended up at a small park on the edge of town. It was a place I hadn't been to in years, but the sight of the tall oak trees and the winding paths brought a bittersweet sense of familiarity. I parked the car and sat there for a while, staring out at the empty playground. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, their chains creaking faintly, and I felt like one of them, caught in a gust, unable to ground myself. I thought about Connor, about the man I had married and the man he had become. Somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred. I didn't know if he had changed or if I had simply started seeing him more clearly. The promises he made in those whiskey-soaked moments weren't just lies. They were reflections of his own desperation to be someone better, someone he couldn't seem to reach no matter how hard he tried, or pretended to try. And for years I had believed that if I loved him enough, if I forgave him enough, I could help him become that man. But love isn't a cure for betrayal. Forgiveness isn't a bandage for wounds that are opened again and again. The first tear slipped down my cheek before I even realized I was crying. And then another until my vision blurred, and the weight of everything I had been holding back crashed over me like a wave. I sobbed into my hands, my body shaking with the force of it. I cried for the love I thought we had, for the dreams we had shared, for the woman I used to be before the lies and the fights and the endless cycle of promises and disappointments. I cried until there was nothing left, until the tears dried up and I was left staring at the steering wheel, my chest aching with exhaustion. When I finally stepped out of the car, the air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. I walked toward the park, letting the quietness of the space surround me. I needed to breathe, to think, to feel something other than the ache in my chest. I sat down on a bench near the swings, watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself imagine a life without Connor. A life where I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop, where I wasn't questioning every word, every glance, every late-night excuse. First, the thought scared me. Connor had been a part of my life for so long that imagining a world without him felt like stepping into a void. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the void might not be as empty as I feared. There was freedom in it, a chance to rebuild, to find myself again. I didn't know who I was without him, but maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time to find out. Over the next few days, I started putting the pieces of my new life together. I stayed with a friend for a while, someone who didn't ask too many questions but offered me a quiet place to think and regroup. I filed for separation, a process that was more painful than I expected, even though I knew it was the right choice. Connor tried to contact me, of course. At first, it was just texts and voicemails, long rambling messages about how sorry he was and how he would do anything to fix things. When I didn't respond, he showed up at my friend's house, banging on the door and begging me to talk to him. But I couldn't. Not anymore. The hardest part wasn't letting go of him. It was letting go of the idea of us. I had spent so much of my life wrapped up in our story, in the hope that we could make it work, that walking away felt like tearing out a part of myself. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to see the cracks in the foundation of what we had built. Connor hadn't just betrayed me. He had betrayed the trust and love that held us together. And I couldn't keep patching up the pieces, pretending that we could go back to the way things were. One evening, I sat by the window at my friend's house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from having all the answers or knowing exactly what the future holds. It was quieter, more subtle. A faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find my way forward. Connor eventually stopped calling. The messages stopped too. I heard through mutual friends that he had moved out of our old house, that he was trying to get his life together. I didn't know if it was true, and honestly I didn't care. His promises no longer held any power over me. I was done waiting for him to change, done believing that I could save him. Months later, I found myself back at that park, sitting on the same bench where I had cried my heart out. But this time I wasn't sad. I watched the children playing on the swings, their laughter filling the air, and I felt a strange sense of clarity. Life goes on whether we're ready for it or not. And as I sat there, I realized that I was ready. Not for a new beginning, but for something even simpler. I was ready to live. Connor's promises had always been a trap, a web of hope and heartbreak that kept me tethered to a version of him that didn't exist. But now I was free. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to save me. I was saving myself. As the days turned into months, the fragments of my old life began to fade into the background, like a melody you hear so often that it becomes white noise. At first, it was hard not to feel the weight of Connor's absence, not because I missed him, but because he had occupied so much space in my life that it felt strange to move through the world without him casting a shadow. But the strangest part wasn't the silence or the solitude. It was the lightness. For the first time in years, I could make decisions without second-guessing myself, without worrying about how he might react or how it would fit into the story of us. I found myself reclaiming parts of my identity I hadn't realized I'd given away. The books I used to love but stopped reading because he didn't like them. The music I turned down in the car because it annoyed him. Even the little things like the way I drank my coffee black, no sugar, just the way I liked it. They seemed insignificant at first, but together they became a thread that I followed, leading me back to myself. One Saturday morning, I decided to tackle a project I'd been putting off for years. Going through old boxes I had stored in the garage of the house I was now renting on my own. These boxes had followed me from place to place, relics of a past life that I hadn't had the courage to confront. But now they felt like a challenge, a mountain I was finally ready to climb. The first box was filled with random items from college, textbooks, photo albums, a few crumpled receipts from nights out with friends. I laughed as I flipped through the photos, marveling at how young and carefree I looked. There was one picture of me at a party, a red Solo cup in hand, my face lit up with laughter. I barely recognized the girl in the photo, but there was a part of me that envied her. She looked so sure of herself, so unburdened by the weight of someone else's problems. The next box was harder to go through. It was filled with things from the early years of my marriage to Connor. Wedding photos, love letters, and little mementos we had collected during our first few years together. First, I wasn't sure I could do it. Just seeing his handwriting on the envelopes made my chest tighten. And for a moment, I thought about shoving the box back into the corner and forgetting about it. But something stopped me. If I was going to move forward, I couldn't keep running from the past. I pulled out the wedding album, flipping through the pages slowly. Our smiles were so bright, so full of hope, and it hurt to see them knowing how things had turned out. But as I looked closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A distance in his eyes, a stiffness in the way he held me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And suddenly I realized that the cracks in our relationship had been there from the start. I just hadn't wanted to see them. By the time I finished going through the box, the ache in my chest had lessened. I wasn't sad anymore. I was angry, not at Connor but at myself. I had spent so much time clinging to the idea of what we could have been that I had ignored the reality of what we were. And now looking back I could see it all so clearly. The red flags I had dismissed. The moments I had compromised when I shouldn't have. The times I had silenced my own needs to keep the peace. It wasn't just him who had failed me, I had failed myself. That realization was like a switch flipping in my mind. I didn't need to carry the weight of his betrayal anymore. It wasn't mine to bear. And I didn't need to keep punishing myself for the mistakes I had made. I had done the best I could with what I knew at the time. But now I knew better. And it was time to do better for myself. Over the next few weeks I started making small changes. I joined a yoga class, something I had always wanted to try but never made time for. I signed up for a writing workshop at the local community center, rediscovering a passion for storytelling that had been buried under years of self-doubt. I even started gardening, turning the small backyard of my rental house into a colorful oasis of flowers and herbs. It was messy and imperfect, but it was mine, and I took pride in every little bloom. One day while I was weeding the garden, I found an old bracelet tucked into the soil. It was cheap and tarnished, probably left behind by a previous tenant, but there was something about it that caught my attention. I cleaned it off and slipped it onto my wrist, letting it serve as a reminder of the resilience I was building. It wasn't about starting over. It was about growing into the person I was always meant to be. Connor's memory began to fade into the background of my life, like an old song I no longer cared to listen to. Occasionally, I would hear updates about him through mutual friends, how he was trying to get sober, how he was seeing a therapist, how he was working on himself. But none of it mattered to me anymore. I didn't wish him ill, but I also didn't wish him back into my life. His journey was his own, just as mine was mine. One evening as I sat on my back porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset, I felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the kind of happiness that comes from having everything figured out. It was quieter, more grounded. A deep appreciation for the moment, for the person I was becoming. For the first time, I wasn't looking to the past or the future. I was simply here in this moment, and it was enough. The promises Connor had made were nothing but echoes now, faint and distant, their power over me long gone. What mattered was the promise I made to myself. To live honestly, to love deeply, and to never again settle for anything less than I deserved. And as I watched the sky darken and the stars begin to shine, I knew I was finally keeping that promise. The stars seemed brighter that night, scattered across the sky like a million tiny promises, each one glinting with a quiet, steady light. I leaned back in the creaky old chair on the porch, the chipped wood cool against my bare arms, and let myself sink into the stillness. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. A quiet that felt earned, like the exhale after holding your breath for too long. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to outrun my thoughts. I wasn't replaying old arguments or trying to decipher the hidden meanings in Connor's words. I was just here. Just me. Just now. I had always thought healing would feel like a dramatic moment of clarity, like stepping into a new life and slamming the door on the old one. But it wasn't like that at all. It was slow, almost imperceptible, like the way sunlight shifts across the floor throughout the day. Some days it felt like I was making progress. Other days, the weight of everything would press down on me again, and I'd feel like I hadn't moved an inch. But I was learning to let those feelings come and go, to accept that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy and uneven, full of starts and stops. And that was okay. I didn't plan to stay in the little rental house forever, but for now it was home. I liked the way the morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, catching the little flecks of dust in the air. I liked the overgrown garden that I was slowly taming, one weed at a time. I liked the way the neighbors waved when they saw me, their smiles warm and unassuming. It was a simple life, quieter than the one I had shared with Connor, but it felt like mine in a way that nothing else ever had. One afternoon I was walking through the local farmer's market, my basket filled with fresh vegetables and a loaf of crusty bread, when I caught a glimpse of someone who looked like Connor. For a moment my heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my hand tightening around the handle of the basket. But when the man turned, I realized it wasn't him. Just a stranger with a similar build, the same messy brown hair. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and continued walking, my pace steady and unhurried. It struck me later how little it had affected me. A few months ago, the sight of someone who even vaguely resembled Connor would have sent me spiraling. I would have spent the rest of the day obsessing over the memories, over what I could have done differently, over whether I had made the right decision in leaving. But now it was just a fleeting moment, a shadow that passed and left no mark. I was learning to let go, not just of him but of the version of myself that had been so deeply tied to him. I started saying yes to things I never would have before. When a coworker invited me to join her book club, I said yes, even though the idea of sitting in a room full of strangers talking about literature made me nervous. When a flyer for a community hiking group caught my eye, I signed up, despite not owning a proper pair of hiking boots. Each small step felt like a reclamation, a way of carving out a new path for myself. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the fear of rejection or failure threatened to hold me back. But I pushed through, reminding myself that I deserved to take up space in the world. One evening, after a particularly grueling hike that left my legs aching but my spirit soaring, I found myself sitting around a campfire with the group. The flames danced and crackled, casting warm, flickering light on the faces of the people around me. Someone passed me a mug of hot cocoa, and I wrapped my hands around it, letting the heat seep into my fingers. For the first time in a long time, I felt connected, not just to the people around me but to myself. I didn't have to be anything other than who I was in that moment. And that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, I started to notice changes in myself. I was laughing more, smiling without forcing it. My shoulders didn't feel as heavy, and the knot in my chest that had been my constant companion for so long was finally loosening. I stopped checking my phone for messages from Connor, stopped wondering what he was doing or if he missed me. It wasn't that I didn't care. I still wished him well in some distant, abstract way, but I no longer felt tethered to his choices or his life. I was building something new for myself, something solid and real. One day, as I was digging in the garden, I found a small sprout poking through the soil. It was just a tiny thing, barely more than a green stem with a few fragile leaves, but it filled me with an unexpected sense of joy. I had planted the seeds weeks ago, not knowing if they would take root or if I had done everything right. And yet here it was, a small hopeful sign that growth was possible, even in the most unlikely places. I knelt in the dirt, brushing the soil gently away from the base of the sprout, and smiled. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still hard days, moments when the loneliness crept in or the weight of everything threatened to pull me under. But those moments didn't define me anymore. They were just passing storms, temporary and fleeting, and I was learning to weather them without losing myself. Each day felt like a small victory, a step forward on a path that I was finally carving for myself. The promises Connor had made no longer haunted me. They were just words now, echoes of a past that I had left behind. What mattered were the promises I was making to myself, the promise to live fully, to love deeply, to be honest about what I needed and what I deserved. And as I stood in my garden, the sun warm on my skin and the scent of earth filling the air, I knew I was keeping those promises. One day at a time, one step at a time, one breath at a time. As the seasons changed, so did I. The sharp chill of winter melted into the softness of spring, and with it, a sense of renewal settled over my life. Each morning felt a little lighter, each evening a little more peaceful. The rhythm of my days became something I cherished, a quiet, steady pulse that no longer revolved around someone else's chaos. I woke up early to water the garden, the soil damp beneath my fingers, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. I made breakfast for myself, savoring the simple act of cooking without the tension of someone else's presence hanging over me. I went to work, came home, and filled my evenings with books, music, or the occasional glass of wine on the porch. It was a life that felt small in some ways, but it was mine, and that made it feel boundless. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I had drifted away from during the years I spent wrapped up in Connor's orbit. At first, I was nervous to reach out, afraid they might resent me for my silence, or that too much time had passed to bridge the gap. But one by one, they welcomed me back with open arms. their kindness and warmth reminding me of who I used to be before I lost myself in someone else's shadows. We met for coffee, for dinners, for long walks in the park. Their laughter filled the spaces in my life that had felt empty for so long, and I found myself laughing with them, the sound startling and unfamiliar at first, but gradually becoming natural again. One evening I sat across from my old college roommate, Maya, at a small cafe downtown. The soft hum of conversation and clinking glasses surrounded us, but I was focused entirely on her. The way her face lit up as she told me about her latest project at work. She paused mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. "You look different," she said, her tone curious. "Happier. Lighter." I smiled, the words settling over me like a warm blanket. "I feel different," I admitted. "It's been a journey, but I think I'm finally starting to find myself again." Maya reached across the table, her hand squeezing mine. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. And in that moment I realized I was proud of myself too. The milestones in my life became quieter, more personal. It wasn't about grand achievements or dramatic transformations. It was about the little things, the moments of peace and joy that felt so rare before but now came more and more frequently. I celebrated the first tomatoes that ripened in my garden, their bright red skins glistening in the sunlight. I celebrated finishing a book I'd been meaning to read for years, the satisfaction of turning the last page leaving a smile on my face. I celebrated the evenings when I could sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky shift from blue to pink to deep indigo, feeling content in a way I never thought possible. Connor became a faint memory, a distant figure in the rearview mirror of my life. Occasionally, I would hear his name mentioned in passing, through a mutual friend or a casual conversation, but it no longer stirred anything in me. The anger, the sadness, the longing, they had all faded, leaving behind a calm acceptance. He was a part of my story, but he didn't define it. I had written new chapters filled with growth and resilience, and those were the pages I chose to focus on. One sunny afternoon, as I was browsing through the shelves of a local bookstore, I bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years. Liam, an old friend from high school, stood there holding a book in his hands, his face lighting up with recognition when he saw me. We spent the next hour catching up, talking about everything and nothing as if no time had passed at all. He had the same easy smile, the same way of making me feel completely at ease. By the time we parted ways, he had slipped his number into my hand, a playful grin on his face as he told me to call him sometime. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to let someone new into my life. But as the days went by, I found myself thinking about Liam more and more. He had always been kind, steady, the kind of person who didn't make promises he couldn't keep. And maybe that's why I finally decided to call him, my heart pounding as I dialed his number. Our first coffee date turned into a second, then a third, and before I knew it, we were spending more and more time together. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or a grand love story. It was slow, steady, and easy, the way things should be. With Liam there were no games, no hidden agendas. Just honesty and kindness and a quiet understanding that we were both bringing our own scars to the table, but we were willing to grow together. I didn't tell him much about Connor at first. It wasn't because I was hiding anything, but because I wanted to focus on the present, on who I was now and who I was becoming. When I finally did open up, he listened without judgment, his hand resting gently on mine as I spoke. "You've been through a lot," he said when I finished, his voice soft but firm. "But it's clear to me that you're stronger because of it." His words stayed with me, a quiet affirmation that I was on the right path. As Liam and I grew closer, I realized that my journey wasn't about replacing what I had lost. It was about building something entirely new. My life with Connor had been a lesson, painful but necessary, teaching me what I wanted, what I deserved, and what I would no longer settle for. And now with Liam, I felt like I was finally stepping into the life I was meant to live. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real, and that was enough. One evening as we sat together on my porch, the stars twinkling overhead, Liam turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "You're like this garden of yours," he said, gesturing to the flowers blooming around us. "You've been through storms, but you've come out of them stronger, more beautiful. And it's a privilege to watch you grow." His words brought tears to my eyes, not because they were poetic or romantic, but because they were true. I had grown. I had weathered the storms, planted new seeds, and tended to the parts of myself I had neglected for so long. And now I was blooming. Life wasn't about the promises Connor had made or the ones he had broken. It was about the promises I made to myself, to keep going, to keep growing, to never again lose sight of who I was. And as I sat there with Liam, the cool evening air wrapping around us, I knew I was finally keeping those promises. The journey wasn't over, it never is, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. I was ready to embrace it, one day, one step, one breath at a time. The weeks melted into months, and life began to feel like a story I didn't need to rewrite, but one I could finally live. The quiet days I once feared became my sanctuary. The stillness, a space where I could hear my own thoughts and trust my own voice. The garden flourished under my care, a kaleidoscope of colors and textures, every bloom a testament to the time and patience I had learned to give myself. Each petal, each sprouting vine, was a reminder that growth is slow, but it's also inevitable when you nurture it. Liam became a steady presence in my life. Not someone who overtook it, but someone who complemented it in ways I hadn't realized I needed. He understood the importance of space, of letting me find my footing without crowding me. Our relationship wasn't defined by grand declarations or sweeping gestures. Instead, it was built in the quiet moments, the way he brewed tea exactly how I liked it, the way his hand found mine when we walked together, the way he really listened when I spoke. With him, I felt seen in a way that didn't demand perfection but embraced the imperfections that made me who I was. One afternoon, we decided to take a drive out to the countryside. The windows rolled down and the warm spring breeze filling the car. Liam hummed along to the music on the radio, a contented smile playing on his lips as the rolling hills stretched out before us. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. After everything I had been through, I hadn't expected this, to find someone who made me feel safe and understood. Someone who didn't try to fix me but supported me as I healed myself. We parked by a small lake and walked down to the water's edge, the grass soft beneath our feet. The lake was serene, the surface rippling gently in the breeze, and we sat together on a blanket, the sun warming our skin. For a while we didn't say anything, content to let the silence stretch between us. Then Liam turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You're not who you were a year ago," he said softly, "but I think you've found someone better in yourself." His words stayed with me long after that day, echoing in my mind as I went about my life. He was right. I wasn't the same person I had been when I left Connor, raw and unsure of what came next. I had grown into someone stronger, someone who understood the value of boundaries and the importance of self-respect. I had learned to find joy in my own company, to trust myself to make decisions without needing someone else's approval. It wasn't about becoming someone entirely new. It was about uncovering the parts of myself I had buried and letting them breathe again. There were moments when the shadows of the past would creep in, uninvited and unwelcome. A familiar song on the radio, a fleeting memory triggered by a scent or a phrase, and for a split second, I'd feel the pang of everything I had lost. But those moments didn't linger the way they used to. I had learned to acknowledge them without letting them take root, to remind myself that they were just pieces of a story I had already finished reading. One evening, as I was tidying up the house, I stumbled upon an old notebook tucked away in a drawer. Curious, I flipped through the pages and realized it was a journal I had started years ago but never finished. The entries were scattered and sporadic, snapshots of a younger version of myself grappling with dreams and doubts. As I read, I couldn't help but smile at the earnestness in my words, the way I had poured my heart onto the page with such unfiltered honesty. One entry caught my attention, written during the early years of my marriage to Connor. In it, I had written about my hopes for the future, about the life I imagined we would build together. Reading it now, the naivety of those words stung, but they also reminded me of how far I had come. The dreams I had once tied to someone else were now my own, untethered and limitless. That night, I started writing in the journal again, filling the blank pages with thoughts and reflections. I wrote about the garden, about the friends who had welcomed me back into their lives, about the sense of peace I was finding in the everyday moments. I wrote about Liam, about the way his presence felt like a quiet assurance that I didn't have to face life alone. But most importantly, I wrote about myself, the woman I was becoming, the lessons I was learning, the promises I was keeping. Each word felt like a declaration, a way of reclaiming my story and honoring the journey that had brought me here. Over time, the journal became a ritual, a space where I could pour out my thoughts without fear of judgment or interruption. It became a mirror, reflecting not just who I was but who I wanted to be. And as the pages filled, I realized that my story wasn't defined by the chapters one had closed, but by the ones I was still writing. Life didn't stop presenting challenges. There were days when the weight of everything felt heavy, when doubt and fear crept in and threatened to pull me back into old patterns. But I had learned to face those moments with compassion, to remind myself that healing wasn't about erasing the pain, but learning to carry it in a way that didn't break me. Each time I stumbled, I picked myself up, dusted myself off, and kept moving forward. And with each step, I grew stronger, more confident, more sure of who I was and what I wanted. The garden became my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the rhythm of planting and tending, where the world seemed to slow down and everything felt simpler. The blooms that flourished under my care were a reminder that beauty could grow even in the aftermath of storms. Each flower was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of nurturing something, even if that something was yourself. On a warm summer evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Liam and I stood together in the garden, the golden light casting long shadows across the grass. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and we stood in comfortable silence, watching the world around us soften into twilight. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet, unwavering sense of belonging. Not just with him, but with myself, with the life I had built, with the woman I was becoming. It was a feeling I had fought hard to find, and now that it was here, I held on to it with everything I had. As twilight deepened and the first stars began to dot the sky, I stayed there in the garden with Liam, soaking in the moment. The air was warm, tinged with the earthy scent of soil and blooming flowers, and the distant hum of cicadas filled the quiet. It was the kind of stillness I had once feared, but now it felt like a gift. A chance to simply exist without the weight of expectations or the fear of what might come next. For so long, my life had been a whirlwind of compromises and chaos, of trying to make sense of broken promises and patching over cracks in a foundation that had never been strong to begin with. But here, in this space I had carved out for myself, there were no cracks. Just soil, sunlight, and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. Liam squeezed my hand gently, pulling me from my thoughts. He smiled, the kind of easy, genuine smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You're lost in that head of yours again," he said softly, his voice laced with affection. I laughed quietly, leaning into him as I shook my head. "Not lost," I replied. "Just thinking about how far I've come." He didn't press me for more. That was one of the things I appreciated most about him. He never pushed, never pried. He simply gave me the space to share when I was ready, and when I did, he listened. Truly listened. It was a kind of love I hadn't known before, one that felt steady and grounding, like an anchor in the storm. Later that night, after Liam had gone home, I sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea in my hands. The house was quiet, save for the soft creak of the old wooden floorboards and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I stared at the bookshelf across the room, my eyes lingering on the journals I had filled over the past few months. They were a testament to the work I had done, the slow but steady progress I had made in rebuilding my life. Each page was a reminder that healing wasn't a single moment of clarity, but a series of small, deliberate choices. Choices to let go of the past, to forgive myself, to embrace the present. As I sipped my tea, a thought crept into my mind, unbidden but persistent. It was about Connor, though not in the way it used to be. I no longer felt anger or sadness when I thought of him, just a kind of distant curiosity. What had become of him? Was he still chasing the promises he had made to himself, or had he found a way to keep them? I would never know, and I realized that I didn't need to. His path and mine had diverged, and whatever he was doing now was no longer my concern. The chapter of my life that included him was closed, and I had no desire to reopen it. But I couldn't deny that his presence in my life, as painful as it had been, had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I set the tea down and stood, walking over to the bookshelf. My fingers brushed over the spines of the journals before settling on one of the older ones. I pulled it down and opened it, flipping through the pages until I found the entry I had written on the day I left him. The words were raw, filled with anger and sorrow, but also with determination. I had promised myself that day that I would never lose myself in someone else's chaos again, that I would learn to love myself as fiercely as I had once loved him. And now, standing here, I realized I had kept that promise. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. I closed the journal and returned it to the shelf, my heart feeling lighter. The past didn't hold the same power over me that it once had. It was still there, a part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I was more than the woman who had been betrayed, more than the broken pieces of a failed marriage. I was someone who had chosen to rise, to rebuild, to bloom in the aftermath of the storm. And that was enough. The next morning I woke early, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. I stretched, feeling the gentle ache in my muscles from the gardening I had done the day before. There was a quiet hum of anticipation in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the day to unfold. I got dressed and stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against my skin. The garden was bathed in golden light, the flowers and leaves glistening with dew. It was a sight that never failed to take my breath away, a reminder of the beauty that could emerge from even the darkest places. As I tended to the plants, pulling weeds and watering the soil, I thought about the life I was building. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, but it was mine, and it was full of moments that brought me joy. Coffee with friends, evenings spent reading on the porch, quiet walks through the park. Even the challenges felt manageable now, like stepping stones rather than obstacles. I had learned to trust myself, to believe in my own strength and resilience. And in doing so, I had discovered a kind of peace I never thought possible. Liam arrived later that morning, carrying a basket filled with fresh bread and fruit. He kissed my cheek as he stepped inside, his presence filling the space with warmth. We spent the day together, cooking, laughing, and simply enjoying each other's company. It was easy, effortless, the kind of connection that didn't demand anything but gave so much in return. With him, I felt like I could be myself, flaws and all, and that was something I would never take for granted. As the sun set and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, we sat together in the garden, the world around us quiet and still. I leaned my head against his shoulder, my heart full of gratitude for this life I had created. It wasn't perfect and it never would be, but it was mine. And in that moment I knew I had everything I needed. The promises I had once clung to, the ones that had been broken, no longer mattered. What mattered were the promises I had made to myself, the promise to heal, to grow, to live. And as the stars began to appear overhead, I felt a deep, unshakable certainty that I was keeping them. The stars blinked gently overhead, tiny pinpricks of light against the vast expanse of the night sky. I sat there in the garden with Liam, my head resting on his shoulder, the scent of jasmine wafting through the air. The world felt still, as if it had paused just for us, granting me this moment to reflect on how far I had come. The journey had been anything but smooth. It had been messy, painful, and full of uncertainty. But as I sat there, surrounded by the life I had built, I knew it had all been worth it. Liam turned to me, his eyes soft and full of something I could only describe as understanding. "You've created something beautiful here," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not just the garden but your life. It's inspiring to watch." His words settled over me, warm and affirming, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no urge to deflect or downplay his kindness. I simply smiled and said, "Thank you." We stayed outside until the air grew cooler, the evening stretching into night. When Liam eventually left, his goodbye lingering in the form of a gentle kiss, I stood in the doorway of my home and looked out at the garden one last time. The moon cast a soft glow over the flowers, their delicate petals swaying slightly in the breeze. It struck me then how much the garden mirrored my own journey. I had started with broken, barren ground, unsure if anything could grow. But with time, patience, and care, I had cultivated something vibrant and alive. I closed the door and walked through the house, switching off lights as I went. In the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I paused by the window, letting my gaze drift over the world outside. The woman staring back at me in the reflection was someone I had fought to become. Strong, resilient, and whole. I had spent so much of my life defining myself through others, clinging to their promises and sacrificing pieces of myself to keep them. But now I stood on my own, unshaken and unapologetic. As I climbed into bed and pulled the blanket up around me, a sense of peace settled over me. The past no longer felt like a weight I had to carry but a story I could leave behind. My life wasn't defined by what I had lost, or the promises that had been broken. It was defined by what I had chosen to keep, my strength, my hope, and my ability to love, both myself and the people who truly deserved it. Closing my eyes, I let out a long, steady breath. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, and new lessons, but I was ready for them. I didn't need anyone else's promises to guide me anymore. I had my own and I was finally fully keeping them. With that thought, I drifted off to sleep, the future no longer a source of fear but a canvas waiting to be filled.